Chapter 43. Death and Hate. Gaggara held on tight, her head tucked in, nuzzling Reyes' neck as he conveyed her carefully over to his bunk. He placed her gently on the edge of the bed so that her feet were resting on the floor, and then he sat beside her, placing one arm around her shoulders. Gaggara moved her head so that it was now resting gently upon his shoulder, and tried to put an arm around him. His wings got in the way a bit, so she settled for holding him around the waist, just above his tail. "I don't think anyone would disturb us until curfew," Reyes assured her. "Let your grief show. Lagnov was a good friend and a good mother, and she will be sadly missed." "I'm sorry, handsome," Gaggara said, her words laden with sorrow. "Sorry?" Reyes cooed. "Sorry for what?" He stroked her shoulder gently. "For this," Gaggara replied. She removed her hand from around him and stood up. She swept both hands quickly down her front to indicate herself. "For the way I'm acting. Here I am, the big, strong harpy, the scourge of farmers everywhere, upset by something as trivial as the death of my mother." She sat back down on the bunk and then lay on her front next to him, hiding her head as best she could in the pillow. Her voice was a little muffled as she said, "There has to be something wrong with me." "Not so." Reyes patted her side lovingly, repeating, "Not so." There wasn't a lot of room to lie next to her, but Reyes did his best, even though it meant he was almost hanging off the edge. Gaggara turned her head to face him. Then she moved to her side, giving Reyes a little bit more of the bed to lie on. "You don't think so? Look how I am at the death of my mother. I'm a harpy. Even the death of a very close friend or relative isn't supposed to have this sort of effect on me. I must be a freak or something." She looked at Reyes as if willing him to contradict her. He did. "Don't be silly," Reyes told her soothingly. He stroked a hand along her arm. "You and your mother were very close. It's not as if you were brought up in a small village where your mother would have been just one of the many women that would have looked after you. You knew your mother in a way that very few of our species could ever perceive. In a way, you were lucky to have that sort of relationship. It's not really surprising that the loss of your mother would have this kind of effect on you." Gaggara looked deep into Reyes' eyes. Perhaps you're right. Would you hold me close? Snuggle me?" "Snuggle you?" Reyes replied, unsure. I just want to be held," Gaggara told him. "Comforted. Nothing more." "Of course," Reyes said willingly. He moved a little closer to her and rested one arm around her waist, while the other he tried to slip round her shoulders. Gaggara lifted her head a little and let him achieve his goal, and then she rested her head gently back onto his forearm. The bed really wasn't big enough for the two of them. It was barely large enough for just Reyes. As he lay there, he couldn't help but think how both his wings and tail were still hanging over the edge of the bed, and Gaggara had to be in pretty much the same boat on the other side. For a moment, he toyed with the idea of pushing her bed closer to his to give them more room. But getting up to do that would mean disturbing her, and right now, he felt she needed him exactly where he was. "Did I ever tell you why I joined the Hope?" Gaggara asked after a couple of minutes. "I don't remember," Reyes told her, keeping his voice to a soft whisper. "You might have. I always thought it was because your mother was already a member." He almost cursed himself for mentioning Gaggara's mother again. Gaggara needed time to grieve, and she didn't need to be reminded of her so recent loss. Even worse, the moment Reyes had spoken, he remembered that they had joined the Hope because Gaggara could no longer afford to live in the hut in Harpy Town. "That's about it," Gaggara agreed. "We could have just gone to the mountains, or maybe we could have found another city to live in. Gulfspawn isn't the only city in the Elven Empire that has a Harpy Town, you know. We didn't. I wanted to live close to my mother. I loved my mother." "I understand," Reyes told her. He pulled her gently towards him, giving her a reassuring hug. I don't think I'm making my point very well. I joined the Hope to be closer to my mother. I even pulled you in against your wishes. I distinctly remember you arguing against us joining, but I was adamant." Reyes nodded. He didn't actually remember it quite like that, but he felt it best to let her speak. "Now she's dead, I no longer have any reason to stay here. No, it's more than that. I want to leave before the invasion. I don't want to be part of any regiment that serves the man who ordered the death of my mother. I don't care what those left behind might think of me. I want to desert." With those words, she looked up at the rest of the barrack house quickly. Fortunately, there was no one else in the building who might have overheard what she said. "I understand," Reyes repeated. He moved his hand round from her waist and stroked her head gently. "Besides, it might be better not to take part in a battle and put our child at risk." "What do you think I should do then?" Gaggara asked. What do you think we should do? I'm not going anywhere if you aren't with me." Reyes hesitated. He wanted to tell her his secret, but something held him back. He was scared that as soon as Gaggara found out what his true intent was, then he would lose her. Right now she hated the Emperor more than anything else in her life. But what if she should discover that he was really the fourth child of Duke Demoth, one of the suspects for the burning down of her mother's village? Then how would she react? She might leave him, taking his child with her. I don't really know, although it wouldn't break my heart if we were to leave the Hope before the invasion begins. Gaggara nuzzled in closer. I'm scared. She kissed him on the nose. I know Dragonman Finert doesn't seem to care what happens to his troops. It's very likely we could just walk out the compound gates and that would be that. But I wouldn't feel comfortable staying in the city afterwards. Suppose they did come after us. Desertion has a terrible penalty. They might make us fight each other in the arena, or even worse, put us in one of those crow's cages that line the streets in and out of the city. I couldn't face that. I think I'd rather kill myself. Reyes kissed her also on the nose. Don't do that. It would ruin your lovely looks. Gaggara seemed to brighten a little. Then there's your new rank. You've just been made a Drakeman. The first harpy in a Hope regiment, indeed the first non-elf to ever achieve the rank of an officer outside of the Raiders. I can't ask you to give that up. The rank is unimportant to me, Reyes told her. I love you. If you want to leave, we just have to decide how, and not hang around just because of some badge that claims that I have a little bit of authority. Besides, as you said, there aren't any non-elf officers in the Hope. I doubt anyone outside of our regiment is even going to believe that my new rank is legitimate. I love you too, Gaggara told him with meaning. No, the rank of Drakeman meant next to nothing to Reyes. He wanted to fly to Castle Demoth tonight before he had even collected the badges of his new rank. It was more important to him to warn his brother of the upcoming invasion and maybe help with the defence or evacuation of the castle. Doing so would mean leaving Gaggara behind. How could he tell her what he planned to do, knowing the hatred she had for the human race? And yet, how could he leave her behind when she was pregnant with his child? Maybe Mother was right, Gaggara said, breaking through his thoughts. Maybe I should just go against all that's conventional and marry you. Just think, I'd be the only girl ever with a male all to myself. Will you marry me? Reyes proposed meaningfully. Maybe, Gaggara teased. She smiled at him. It was nice to see her smiling at last. The conversation ebbed to where they were just lying there, looking at each other and holding each other. Then Gaggara's eyes slowly closed, and before Reyes knew it, she was snoring contentedly in his arms. Reyes slowly extricated one of his arms from her. The other she still seemed to be using as a pillow, and although it had started to go a little bit numb, he loathed moving it and risked waking her. Instead, he just lay there looking at her, thinking how lucky he was to have such a lovely girlfriend. He closed his eyes and thought about that day's events. Was there anything he could have done that might have stopped Lagnoff from dying? Darty had offered him the choice of sending whoever he wanted into the fight. Perhaps if he had taken up that offer, he could have saved Lagnoff's life simply by not naming her. He shook the thought from his head. He felt as if he was thinking like a harpy. Yes, Lagnoff would still be alive, but at the cost of another. Who was he to decide who lived and who died? Sitting like some tin-pot god in judgment of his fellow creatures? No, it might be hard to admit, but he felt he had done the right thing by letting Darty make the selection. Something else occurred to Reyes. Something Darty had done. Reyes couldn't think of what it was, but he had the feeling that Darty had done something that wasn't physically possible, even with magic. It wasn't killing Lagnoff, no. It was something a lot more subtle than that. Darty had somehow broken one of the laws of magic in such a way that no one had really noticed. And maybe even Darty himself hadn't realised he had done it. Reyes didn't pursue the thought further. If there was something, he couldn't think of what it could be. Maybe his own mind was just trying to find excuses, his subconscious resolving to turn Darty into even more of a monster than he already was, for having struck down Gaggara's mother. Reyes sighed. He slowly pulled his arm free of Gaggara and slipped carefully out of bed. She was sleeping like a baby, and Reyes felt that she needed to sleep. He also felt that she would likely need him to be there when she woke up. But first, he needed to make a quick trip outside. Stepping out of the barrack house, Reyes noticed someone, a harpy, standing there on the edge of the drill ground, watching some of the other races play that stupid game again. The last time he had seen it played, they had been trying to compete for the possession of a cow's leg bone. This time the MacGuffin was a small-scale model of the island of Arlis. Over time, it seemed to change, becoming a small statue of what was quite possibly the most attractive harpy that Reyes had ever seen, naked, and yet holding what looked like a sheet in her left hand to hide her modesty. It was nice that someone had already cleared away all the bodies. There weren't even any signs that blood had been spilt on the ground. Agnar had done a good job in the short time that Reyes had been gone. "How is she?" the harpy asked, glancing over her shoulder. Reyes didn't recognise her, but she reminded him of Kathleen in some way. "She'll be fine," Reyes replied. He walked over to her and stood next to her. "I love her, you know. One day I plan to marry her." "Of course you do," the harpy replied. Her face seemed to twist into a parody of itself. She became a vicious beast, drooling with base hunger. Her fangs seemed somehow enlarged and were bared in his direction. She growled, "You should marry me as well." Reyes stuttered. He had never seen any harpy like that before. She was like an animal, with nothing but lust in her eyes. "Take me," she snarled hungrily. "Take me now, here, in front of everyone." Reyes took a step back, unsure what to do. All in all, it was almost a relief when the entire compound was suddenly plunged into darkness, as a huge shadow flew overhead, blotting out the sun. It was a dragon. It looked a lot like one of those traditional artists' renditions of what a dragon was supposed to look like, only many, many times bigger. It was hard to be sure, but Reyes estimated it roughly the size of the entire kingdom of Floreth, from the tip of its nose to the spikes on the end of its tail. It was primarily black. Large glistening scales covered its legs, back and tail, each one shining with an inner light like a minor star, and each one the size of a small city. The dragon's underside, the area between its four legs, was a light, shiny grey. The scales on the dragon's underside were extremely tiny, like a sprinkling of glittery diamond dust. Then there were the stripes, on either side of the dragon, running all the way along the creature's length from the very tip of its tail to the beast's eyes, were long, thin red stripes. Actually, the stripes were probably as thick as 3 or 4 full-sized roads laid down side by side, but on the dragon they looked quite thin. The stripes encapsulated the dragon's eyes and ended with a pair of horns, positioned in such a way that it was hard to imagine how the dragon could ever see properly. The creature took a good 5 minutes to complete its flyby. It flew much faster than a harpy could even dream of flying, and yet it was still several minutes before the sun was visible again. Then it swooped low over the countryside, its front legs poking down into the forest no closer than 5 miles away, uprooting trees as if it was having the time of its life. It swung round, facing back towards the city. Its tail and its rear legs must have been at least as far south as First Town. The creature was so big, and had to be so heavy, that the mere act of landing should probably have caused great earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and maybe even tidal waves to engulf the city. Yet there was nothing. Not even the lightest of tremors. Then, with its front paw still a good 5 miles away, the dragon lowered its great neck slowly until it was looking directly at Reyes, as if it had singled him out for its attention. Its head was as big as the city. Each eye was several times the size of the entire Hope's compound. It could easily have been looking at anyone there, and yet somehow Reyes knew that it was looking straight at him. Then suddenly he realised he was alone. The other harpy had gone. The players had gone. Everyone had gone. He was alone on the drill ground. No, it wasn't just the drill ground, or even just the barracks. He was the only living thing in the whole city, and quite possibly the world.
"Waste them off!"
The dragon spoke fluent flourish without moving its lips. Its voice boomed across the entire countryside.
"I know who you are, waste them off."
"Who are you?" Reyes replied. It was strange, but he had no sense of fear as he stood before the dragon. The dragon lifted its head.
"Names. Back when I was young we didn't have names. There are only 12 of us. What need would we have for names? I suppose if I have any name it should be the one given to me by the humans. They call me the son of death and hate."
"I see," Reyes replied doubtfully.
"You need to know. Your girlfriend Gaggara's hatred of humanity is really a hatred that belongs with her mother. Gaggara wasn't born until after her mother had left the village. She has no recollection at all of village life, any more than you do. Her hatred of the elves is even stronger now that they have killed her mother. To Gaggara, that is a much more personal loss. If you should decide to tell Gaggara the truth about yourself, then she will understand, and she will come with you. You might be surprised at just how easily she will change allegiances so long as you are with her.
Why are you telling me this? Reyes pressed. It felt strange making any sort of demand of this creature, especially considering how large it was. And yet there simply was no fear. What advantage is there for you?
I have seen the future,
The dragon admitted.
Actually, I've seen many futures. You play a key role in many of them. One day, I might even be forced to ask you for a favour.
A creature as big and powerful as you? Reyes began.
Yes.
The dragon's voice echoed loudly about the land and the sky.
Even I. To that end, I leave you with this warning. Should Gaggara fight in a siege of Castle Demoth, she will die.
But
if you want her to live, you must ensure that she takes no part in the assault.
The dragon told him. The creature turned a little, its head moving so that it was now at least 5 miles away, as if it was getting ready to leave. Yet the dragon's voice still reached Reyes loud and strong.
Find some excuse, any excuse to keep her out of harm's way. Perhaps before the battle starts, you should send her on a hunt in the nearby forest. It doesn't matter, so long as she isn't there when the battle begins.
I'll try, Reyes told the beast. She's very strong-willed, but I'll try.
Do,
the dragon insisted,
or you will be mourning the loss of not just your girlfriend, but also your unborn daughter.
A daughter, Reyes repeated. I'm going to have a daughter.
Congratulations,
the dragon bellowed.
Now, it's time I was leaving, and it's time you woke up.
Woke up? Reyes commented. Well, what do you mean? Reyes woke up. He looked bleary-eyed at the figure of Gaggara still lying beside him. Her eyes closed as she slept, in a way that made her seem so cute and cuddly. It was sometimes hard to imagine that Gaggara was a member of a race of the most efficient and merciless killers known to the world. He looked briefly over his shoulder at the door of the barracks house. That door was opening and closing almost constantly, as those of the regiment that shared these barracks began to filter their way in. There was only one reason why so many soldiers might all enter the barracks at roughly the same time. Somehow, it was already time for evening curfew. Had he been asleep? Reyes had a feeling that he must have been asleep if the day had passed so quickly. Part of him felt as if he couldn't have been asleep. He had been lying here on the bed just gazing at Gaggara. He hadn't taken his eyes off her. Could he have been asleep? Yet niggling at the back of his mind was a feeling that he had not only been asleep, but that he had just had the strangest of dreams. The subject of this dream seemed to float at the very edge of his memory, just out of reach. He sighed happily. It didn't matter, it was only a dream. How important could a dream be? Instead, he turned his attention back to Gaggara and tried to extricate his now very numb arm from under her head without disturbing her. He loved her very much. He considered himself very lucky to be with a girl as wonderful and as beautiful as she. He would do anything for her. To think, he had actually kept secrets from this wonderful creature. She knew very little about his life prior to his arrival in the city. The few things that Gaggara did know about him, Reyes had been careful to spin, in order to make it sound like he was a prisoner rather than the son of Duke Demoth. As he lay there on the bed looking at Gaggara in all her loveliness, he began to wonder how long he could continue to lie to the girl he loved. Maybe it was time to come clean with her, tell her the truth of his youth and his real relationship with the Demoth family. It may be that he would lose her as a result, but how could he truly claim he loved her if he didn't tell her the truth?